Welcome back, my name is Jumbo Commander, and today I have a deck tech featuring Tasigur the Golden Fang. Tasigur the Golden Fang, 5 and a black for a 4/5 legendary human shaman with Delve. So we're going to be able to reduce that 6 converted mana cost to much less if we can fill up our graveyard. He has an activated ability that says 2 Simic. Simic is green or blue. Put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, then return a non-land card of an opponent's choice from your graveyard to your hand. The first thing that draws me to Tasigur is his color identity. There are not very many commanders in Sultai. If you ignore the partner commanders, which have been a big help, there are only 5 Sultai commanders total. That does not leave a lot of options. So a powerful card like Tasigur that doesn't force you into a specific strategy is very desirable. But one thing is that Tasigur doesn't force us into a specific strategy. Yes, he plays around with the graveyard a little bit, but really he's just a valuable legendary creature, which means that we have too many directions to go when building Tasigur. There's no set path. Now, I personally think that's really good, and that's why I've decided to go my own way with Tasigur. But first thing I want to cover is what most people do with Tasigur, and that's just Sultai good stuff. If you look at a lot of Tasigur decks online, you're going to see some of the best blue, black, and green cards all jammed together into one deck. And that sounds great to me. It sounds really fun. But you don't need me making a video telling you about good blue, black, and green cards. If you want to make a competitive deck, you should prioritize inexpensive CMC cards that are very interactive. If you want to make a fun deck, then you pick out whatever you find fun. Throw in Rise of the Dark Realms after you mill your opponents with Consuming Aberration. If you want to have a deck that works really well in your playgroup, then try and match it to your meta. If you want to make a budget deck, go through your own cards and throw them all into a Tasigur deck, and I'm pretty sure you're gonna have a fun time. So I do want to talk about the useful good stuff cards, but then I want to divert into my own personal strategy and how I built Tasigur. One of the key features of a Tasigur deck is getting things in our graveyard. Tasigur himself does a great job of that with his activated ability. Tasigur is always going to be pretty inexpensive to play from our command zone because of that Delve ability. As it turns out, Delve is pretty good. So Murderous Cut, Dig Through Time, and Treasure Cruise all have easy inclusions in this deck. Now you would think other Delve cards are a non-bow with our commander. They eat up cards in the graveyard, so if Tasigur dies, he's harder to deploy a second, third, fourth time onto the battlefield. But really, Delve matches up really well with Tasigur's activated ability. If you cast a Treasure Cruise and exile a stupid ramp spell, a card draw spell, a removal spell from your graveyard, then you won't be getting those back when you activate Tasigur's ability. You might just get your Treasure Cruise back or get your really powerful creature back. So Delve lets us interact with our graveyard in a different way, giving Tasigur more value. Actually, that's why I've included a Deathrite Shaman in my Tasigur builds. Usually it's an underwhelming creature in Commander. Deathrite Shaman is unreliable when you need it as a mana source. I do like that it disrupts opponents' graveyard play, but it has an activated and tapped ability, so sometimes your opponents can get around it. But it's that selective nature that I'm drawn to in this deck. Deathrite Shaman can pick out the creatures you don't care about anymore, leaving Tasigur's activated ability only hitting good stuff. It's also nice to note that when you exile an instant or sorcery, each opponent loses 2 life, and that's not an inconsequential amount of damage. Now, I've spoken a lot about Tasigur's activated ability. Let's make that activated ability cheaper with Training Grounds. Suddenly, just playing a Simic is going to be really powerful for recurring a card from your graveyard. Hearthstone does a poor impression of Training Grounds. Did I say Hearthstone? Hearthstone does a poor impression of Training Grounds. And Mesmeric Orb can make sure that you have a very full graveyard to take advantage of. I want to mention one more card that works really well with graveyards, and that's Seasons Past. In this deck, it can regularly get back 4, 5, 6 cards from your graveyard. It's incredibly powerful. And another thing that comes to mind is a Tasigur Canadian Highlander deck that plays Seasons Past, Time Warp. Actually, they play Time Walk, but it's banned in our format. So Time Warp and Mystical Tutor. This combination of cards goes infinite. You play a Time Warp to get an extra turn, then you play a Seasons Past to get a bunch of cards back. The Seasons Past does not go in your graveyard, it goes back into your library. So a tutor, like Mystical Tutor or Demonic Tutor, can get the Seasons Past right back on top of your library to do it again the following turn. Now, this costs 12 mana, what I have on the screen. In Canadian Highlander, because they use Time Walk, it costs 3 less. It costs only 9 mana to pull this off. But hey, it's a cool combo, and it's certainly not broken. It costs 12 mana, so if you have a really grindy game and you suddenly Seasons Past people out, that could be an outlet to games that have really gone on far too long. So now let's move on to my take on Tasigur, and first thing I want to inspire you with is my motivation. My motivation is tremendous villainous wealth. Villainous Wealth is X black, green, blue for a sorcery that reads, target opponent exiles the top X cards of his or her library. You may cast any number of non-land cards with converted mana cost X or less from among them without paying their mana costs. It is like an awesome Genesis wave for your opponent's deck. It is such a fun way to finish games, and I love it, and I need to play it more. But there's such a color restriction being in Sultai that I couldn't easily slot this into other decks. There's also the restriction of needing so much mana to really Villainous Wealth for the right amount, which has got to be something like 10. I think that's the minimum I want a Villainous Wealth for. So I made a deck that was based around Villainous Wealth, and I added a few more cards to sort of support this big mana Sultai strategy, and that's Torment of Hailfire and Exsanguinate. And one of the reasons why I've decided to present this deck for you right now is because of Hour of Devastation. I think I have 6 new cards from Hour of Devastation in this deck. And that's insane for people that keep commander decks for a long time to have a set come out and then suddenly you include maybe 1 or 2 cards from the new set, but 6 added to this strategy. I just needed to talk about them. And Torment of Hailfire is a perfect card for this deck. Being able to go big with Villainous Wealth is fun, but I need a backup. And Torment of Hailfire definitely puts people in tough situations. Now, of course, I always had the backup of Exsanguinate, and it's still in the deck, but it's kind of a boring win condition. Let's talk about a few more win conditions I have in this deck. The next one is Worm Harvest. 2 Golgari, that's green or black. Create a 1/1 black and green worm creature token for each land card in your graveyard. But this has Retrace. You may cast this card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other costs. So you might be thinking to yourself, how many lands do you need in your graveyard to make this worthwhile? And probably a lot, but wouldn't it be great if you just had a ton of lands in your graveyard and you could just worm harvest people to death? That just sounds fun. Now, this is in my deck, and I've played it a few times and gotten like 5 or 6 worms, but I've never truly killed someone with Worm Harvest. So if you're looking to have your deck be a little bit more powerful, you might want to cut this card. But if you're looking for it to be awesome, you need this card. So this deck also has a few other win conditions in the form of its lieutenants. Its lieutenants are the Gitrog Monster and Titania, Protector of Argoth. Both of these cards give huge advantage, Titania getting lands straight back onto the battlefield and creating really dangerous 5/3s. The Gitrog Monster drawing you card after card and helping you hit more land drops. There's a third lieutenant that also fulfills the role of a win condition, the Scarab God. Like I said, there's going to be some milling going on, and I'm going to want to eternalize some creatures and get some advantage. So the Scarab God goes perfectly in this deck and also uses up a lot of the big mana that we're going to be producing. Mostly for Villainous Wealth and Worm Harvest, but you know, we can eternalize some Scarab God creatures. So I've described for you a Sultai lands deck where we play around with all of the lands, get tons of lands drops, manipulate our mana base, and get huge amounts of mana to drain our opponents out eventually after dirtling for a while. So what we need is huge ramp. We just need it all. And the card that really gives us all this ramp is Splendid Reclamation. 3 and a green, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is a huge ramp card in a deck that will mill yourself. I mean, you just Tasigur a few times, your opponents can't give you lands back, and then suddenly, boom, Splendid Reclamation, you've ramped from 6 mana to 14 mana. And now you're in the range of really doing damage with that Villainous Wealth. There are a lot of cards that are really important to the ramp strategy. One of them is to play more than 1 land a turn. Exploration, Burgeoning, Azusa Lost But Seeking, Oracle of Mildiah, and the Gitrog monster himself all let us play multiple land drops. And the reason why this is really important is that this deck is running something like 45 lands. That's a lot more than the normal land count. So this is the ramp that we're looking for to try and move us forward. We're also interacting with our graveyard a lot with lands, so cards like Ramunap Excavator, Crucible of Worlds, and Life from the Loam are really important. Look at this, Ramunap Excavator, another card from Hour of Devastation belonging in this deck. Now, if we want lands from our graveyard into play, then it behooves us to have lands go into our graveyards. So we want cycling lands, which by the way also work really well with the Gitrog monster. Ash Barrens or Fetid Pools is a new card. Oh, amazing. We also want fetch lands. Polluted Delta is great. We want lands that sacrifice other lands when they enter the battlefield. Lotus Veil is really good. Blighted Catarch draws us cards. We want utility lands that go away, like Throne of the High City, which will give us the Monarch, or Dust Bowl, which will kill our opponent's lands. And as long as we're sending so many lands to the graveyard, let's just throw in a random card that just kind of fits in here, Aid from the Cowl. It's a newish card that has a lot of upside that it might be a little bit hard to play in some decks, but we have so many sacrifice outlets for our lands that this could be just a winning card in this deck. The more lands we have in our graveyard, the better, because we can take advantage of these effects, the Excavator, the Crucible, the Life from the Loam. They also combine really well with the cards I just mentioned, Exploration, Azusa, the Gitrog monster. Because those give us extra land drops, we have more access to lands in our graveyard than we might have in our hand. One crucial distinction is that Burgeoning says that you can put a land from your hand into play, not you get an extra land drop. So that does not synergize with these graveyard land abilities, the Crucible effects, but the other ones do. Now, why do we want so many lands in our graveyard? Well, we mentioned the Splendid Reclamation, but also getting lands into our graveyard could be a byproduct of more value. See, Tasigur tries to get a lot of value by putting cards into your graveyard and getting them back into your hand, but it doesn't hit lands. So if you just activate Tasigur a bunch of times, you're going to naturally end up with some lands in your graveyard. Also, loot effects give us a great opportunity to discard lands and keep the cards that we draw. Intuition will let you tutor up 3 different cards. One will end up in your hand and the other 2 in your graveyard. Ancient Excavation is a windfall effect, but it's selective. So you can draw your hand and then discard, I'm assuming, a bunch of lands and keep the stuff you need in your hand. This also has basic land cycling in case you get a little bit caught behind in terms of land drops. Fact or Fiction is great because the cards you don't choose end up in your graveyard instead of someplace silly like on the bottom of your library. Forbidden Alchemy lets you see a bunch of cards, but also has the great ability of flashback. That's another thing we might want to pay attention to, is being able to flashback cards since we're so easily able to get them into our graveyard. And Monastery Siege is an enchantment that lets you loot every single turn, not just a one-off like all the other ones I mentioned. Those spells will get any cards into your graveyard, but there are a few that get lands specifically into your graveyard. Scape Shift lets you sacrifice any number of lands you want, and then trade them up into even better lands. We have a ton of utility built into the lands in this deck, so being able to have access to our entire library of the best lands, amazing. Realms Uncharted also tutors lands out of our library. We get 2 into our hand and 2 into our graveyard. And Crop Rotation is amazing because it lets us interact with our opponent at instant speed with our lands. It only costs 1 mana to sacrifice a land and then put whatever land we want from our library straight into play. Now this is great because let's say our opponent plays a Living Death. And then what do? Crop rotation a Bojuka Bog onto the battlefield in response. Ugh. Or let's say our opponent is Craterhoof Behemothing us to death. No, just kidding. Let's crop rotation a Glacial Chasm straight into play. Our lands are really valuable, and so the ability to search them up, specifically non-basics, is going to be really powerful. And if we have lands in our graveyard, so what? We know we can take advantage of lands in our graveyard. One other land tutor is Teleria West. It has a transmutability of 1 blue, and you can discard this card, and by the way, that puts a land in the graveyard, bonus. But then we get to search for any card in our library with converted mana cost 0. It's a land 0 converted mana cost. That lets us tutor for any land, or if you want this to be a little bit more competitive, you could tutor for a Pact of Negation to sort of protect you if you are going to be playing a huge spell like a Villainous Wealth, perhaps. I got a couple more land tutors. Tempt with Discovery. Amazing. Guys, don't take the tempting offer. Everyone always does. It's so tempting. Hour of Promise. Another Hour of Devastation card. I can't believe it. Also lets us tutor up 2 lands. Now, I've been putting a big emphasis on getting non-basic lands, and that's because we have this deck chock full of them. But that doesn't mean you have to build the deck this way. Non-basic lands are really expensive and really corner case. You could go with a big mana strategy that revolves around basic lands. I'm not running Cultivate and Kodama's Reach because I just don't have the basic count, but they go really well if you do have enough basics, so consider them. I am running Harrow because I like the sacrifice effect even if it only can fetch up basics. But if you are going heavy basics, man, a card like Boundless Realms lets you double up your land count on the battlefield. It's insane. So feel free to tone down the non-basic land count and pick up the basic land ramp, which can definitely go bigger than the non-basic land ramp. But all this talking about lands, and I haven't even mentioned any real awesome lands. Let's get straight into all of the lands that we have in this deck and how we can weaponize them against our enemies. You have a lot of options when it comes to lands, but one thing I want to do is have a lot of controlling lands because this deck is not designed to go off fast. I'm trying to kill someone with a huge Villainous Wealth, and I have no infinite combos to get all of that mana, so we're going to have to stall the game. So we want protection in terms of our opponent's graveyards. Scavenger Grounds and Bojuka Bog do a great job of that. Now we also want to manipulate our own graveyard, so Scavenger Grounds might be a non-bo in some situations, but I have to say I've used this ability on myself before. I have a bunch of junk in my graveyard, and so I actually exile my graveyard, and then when I play a spell and activate Tasigur, I have much higher spell quality in my graveyard. Endless Sands protects my creatures, especially those lieutenants I like a lot, because once the Gitrog monster dies, it's much harder to get him back, and he's such a cool card, so I'm going to protect him with Endless Sands. I'm also going to protect my lieutenants and commander with Winding Canyons, being able to flash them in at the end of turn and then get a lot of value from them on my turn. I also want to protect my spells. I have a few spells that are designed to finish the game, so Beseiju, who shelters all, is really critical to combat counter strategies. I also want to protect myself against other creatures, so Maze of Ith can take care of one big creature, Glacial Chasm can take care of an army, but only for a limited amount of time, and if you have all the money, you can get a Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale and really punish creature decks. I also felt like I needed to include Tabernacle because it's such a critical part of the Legacy Lands deck, and that is a lot of inspiration for how this deck runs and plays against other decks. And speaking of Legacy Lands, Dark Depths is a huge Legacy win condition, so I play it in this deck. It combines wonderfully with Thespian Stage. You can also trigger it with Vampire Hexmage, Thief of Blood, and the new Mirage Mirror. Another Hour of Devastation card, including the 2 lands I just mentioned before. Oh, it's getting out of control. And this got me thinking about weaponizing lands. And so I looked to some planeswalkers that could help us weaponize lands, specifically Nissa. she always has the ability to turn lands into creatures. So I think Nissa, Steward of Elements could be a cool addition. I really like the card, but I also really like the ability to just smash people for 10 in the air with your lands. I think that's really neat. But really, the card we should be including is Nissa Vital Force, because all we have to do is tick her up once and then ultimate her to be able to get an insane emblem in this deck. We have so many lands. If we draw a card every time we play one, the game is just over. Nissa Worldwaker is also pretty cool because it lets us use our lands as creatures. But one of the better cards that we could include is Kamal, Fist of Krosa, because it creates an army out of nothing, making your lands into huge trampling monsters. Kamal also gives you a lot of protection because if your opponents ever threaten a board wipe, you can always activate their lands and turn them into 1/1 creatures. Oh yeah, it's real mean. We don't always have to have our lands do the actual attacking. How about Retreat to Hagra? Now this is a very minor effect. We drain whenever we have landfall, but with Splendid Reclamation, we could drain our opponents for 10 or 20. That would be very cool. But this is not a very strong winning strategy. We could also include a card like Altar of the Brood. Now this is really cool because it allows us to have a sort of cyclical mill strategy. Again, not very strong, but we could throw it in there if we have other cards like the Scarab God, like Diluvian or Sepulchral Primordial, if we want to take advantage of our opponent's graveyards as well as our own. This land section is kind of transitioned into our win conditions, so lands could also help us win by triggering Rampaging Baloths or Avenger of Zendikar. We can also have a huge Uvenwald Hydra while also searching up a land we want, or have a recursive threat like Centaur Vinecrasher. And of course, we already mentioned some of our win conditions earlier. If we have a big enough land count, Villainous Wealth destroys people along with Torment of Hailfire and Exsanguinate. So that is my Tasigur the Golden Fang Sultai lands deck. It's super fun to durdle around with lands, and I hope you enjoy this style of Tasigur. Now remember, there's a ton of ways to build this guy, so feel free to go wild, but if you want to go with a heavy ramp strategy into janky win conditions, I think you'll really enjoy this deck tech. I want to thank you very much for watching. My name is Jumbo Commander, and I make Commander content on YouTube. If you liked what you saw and want to see more, consider subscribing because I'll have a new video every Wednesday. But if you subscribe, you'll be readily informed when I put out a new video, like a random video that I'm going to put out sometime this week at an unknown time when I finish editing it. So unless you subscribe, it could fly past in your queue. So do that, and I'm excited to see you guys really soon. Bye-bye.